Hello, everyone. This is the fourth subtopic of Part 1, Section E on internal controls. And since this is the fourth one, this is also the second to the last topic. And this will be all about general and application controls. So the controls, this is actually in particular to computers or for those companies that are using softwares as part of their operations. So the classification of controls, we have two. We have general controls and application controls. Actually, these two controls are very much easy to understand because when we speak of general controls, these are controls that are applicable to all system components, processes, and data in a system's environment. So when we say general, this applies to all because this is general. No, this is all encompassing. So all components of our system's environment are covered by these general controls. For application controls, this time, these are specific. So it doesn't apply to all components and processes, but rather these controls are specific to individual applications and are designed to prevent, detect, and correct errors and irregularities in transactions during the input, processing, and output stages. So again, application controls are only specific to a particular part of our system's environment, and application controls are more concerned on the transactions on the input side, process side, and the output side. So only those three: input, process, and output. However, in contrast, general controls are applicable to all. It is all encompassing and it is also broad in aspect. It is very by the name itself, no, general. It is very much general such that it could be applied to all parts of the system's environment. So both general controls and application controls are essential because if you only have general controls and you do not have application controls, then your control environment will still be very weak. Your internal control will be very weak. And vice versa, if you have application controls but you do not have general controls, there are still huge risks that errors will occur in the processing of your transactions, and there is also a risk of fraudulent transactions. So again, general controls relate to the general environment within which transaction processing takes place. General controls are designed to ensure that the company's control environment is stable and well managed. So remember the components of your internal control. First, we have the control environment. So the general controls actually apply mostly to your first component, which is your control environment. A stable and well-managed control environment strengthens the effectiveness of the company's application controls. So an example, these are examples of general controls. We have administrative controls, which includes segregation of duties. We have computer operations controls, controls over the development, modification, and maintenance of computer programs. Software controls, hardware controls, data security controls, and provision for disaster recovery. So we will have a separate subtopic for disaster recovery under business continuity planning, okay, which I will discuss in the next recorded discussion. So the general controls we have learned here above are organized according to the following categories. So we have three categories. So the first category is the organization and operation of computer facilities and resources, including administrative controls and computer operation controls. So administrative controls such as provision for segregation of duties within the data processing function. Okay, so if you notice here, there is a huge role of segregation of duties. Um, we can say that segregation of duties is a very important control that we should implement in our organization. So you can also apply segregation of duties within the data processing function. And segregation of the data processing function from other operations. And we have supervision of personnel involved in the control procedures to ensure that the controls are performing as intended. So we should have different employees. No, we should have different employees performing different functions. So for example, whoever is in charge for coding, diba? Since we are talking about systems naman or softwares, there is your IT expert that is in charge for the systems coding. Kanang magbuhat og codes for the development of the system. And then naputay database administrator and other IT experts. So different functions should be performed by different people. So that's the essence of segregation of duties. And we should also have a supervisor that will oversee all other employees within our IT department. We have computer operations controls. A systems control group should monitor production, keep records, balance your input and output, perform manual procedures designed to prevent and detect errors, and see that work is completed on schedule. Another category of general controls is what we call general operating procedures, and this include the following. So we have the written policies, procedures, and manuals that establish standards for controlling information systems operation, which should be available and should be kept up to date. So, for example, if we have to troubleshoot our system or program, we should have a ready manual or policies and procedures that we can always refer to every time we need some help in operating this particular software or system. And these policies and procedures should also be kept up to date. They should include controls over the setup of processing jobs, operations software, and computer operations, and backup and recovery procedures. So for example, our office was hit by a fire, suffered damage. So how are we able to recover our records nga ang ato ang computers and laptops have been destroyed man? So what are the procedures? So we should have a ready written procedure for these type of scenarios, and as well as instructions for running computer jobs. The policies, procedures, manuals, and instructions should be documented and reviewed and approved by a manager. Another example of general operating procedures, we have the operating procedures that specify the process to be followed in system development and system changes in order to provide reasonable assurance that the development of and changes to computer programs are authorized, tested, and approved prior to use. So for example, let's say the organization is initially using manual processing. So let's say at the start of the year, wala pa sila nagamit og mga computers, mga software, so all manuals lang, all papers lang. But then the managers have decided that it's time for us to use a system or a software. So for example, we hired IT experts to develop a particular system. Let's say for the keeping of inventories or for the computation of payrolls. So in any na mga software. So we should make sure that any developments to this software are authorized. And then after the creation of the software, it should be tested first. And then after initial testing, it should be approved na for use. And if we have an existing software already and we want to change it, we will not call it anymore systems development, but rather system changes. So for example, we have an existing software, and then we want to incorporate new changes to adjust to special na mga transactions nga dili pa makater sa kaninga software. So we need to make some changes and adjustments. So we should also make sure that these changes are authorized, tested, and approved before it could be used by everyone. Another category of general controls is your software, hardware, and access controls. So software controls monitor the use of software and prevent unauthorized access to software applications and system software. So for example, pinaka-basic na software control, no, is your creation of password. So if you do not have the password for this particular type of program, then you will not be able to access the program. Or for example, the program has different modules, and then we want to prevent everyone from viewing all modules. So for example, if you are assigned for the creation of invoices, customer invoices. So let's say you will only have access to the sales module and the accounts receivable module, but you will not have access to other modules such as your payroll modules or the manufacturing modules or inventory modules. So that's also an example of a software control. And then we have hardware controls. These are here to keep computer hardware physically secure, to protect it from fires and extremes of temperature and humidity, and to provide for disaster recovery. So hardware controls include monitoring for equipment malfunctions, such as controls installed in computers that can identify incorrect data handling or malfunction of the equipment. I believe this is understandable naman. So these are for the protection of the hardware itself without looking into the software or the programs that are installed in our computers. Then we have access controls to equipment and data, such as controls over physical access to the computer system that are adequate to protect the equipment from damage or theft. So for example, if we have a huge network of computers, maka-imagine mo na ano sa movies pa nga, na ay isa ka floor nga intended for a network of computers, daghan kaayong mga computers na dito, and then only authorized persons could access that floor sa building. So that's an example of an access control to prevent it from damage or theft. Access controls also include data security controls that ensure that files are not subject to unauthorized access, change, or destruction, both when they are in use and when they are being stored. Like for example, if we have mga external drives kanang for the memory let's say mga USBs or kanang mga dagko nga mga drives, we will keep it in a place where naadyo mga security features such as naapedron siya physical lock or kailangan siya of access card before siya ma-open. Okay, so those are for our general controls. Let's now move on to application controls. And these are just overviews how we will dwell into these general controls and application controls thoroughly after our general overview. Application controls are specific, again, to individual applications. They ensure that only authorized data are processed by the application and that the data are processed completely and accurately. Thus, application controls are designed to prevent, detect, and correct errors in transactions as they flow through the input, processing, and output stages of work. So again, always remember that when we speak of application controls, they will always relate to input, process, and the output stages. Okay, so the main categories Very obvious naman, no? The main categories of application controls are our input controls, process controls or processing controls, and then output controls. So just a brief overview, input controls are designed to provide reasonable assurance that input entered into the system has proper authorization, has been converted to machine sensible form, and has been entered accurately. So again, input. Then processing controls, still to provide reasonable assurance that, or this time, that processing has occurred properly and no transactions have been lost or incorrectly added. Then output controls to provide reasonable assurance that the input and processing have resulted in a valid output. Okay, so muna siya to ang overview of these two types of controls, general controls and application controls. Let's delve into these controls one by one. So first, general controls. Again, we have three categories here, right? Remember here. So we have three categories for general controls. Okay, so the first one is organization and operation of computer facilities. So we should have IT planning and steering committee that should oversee the IT function. Members should include senior management, user management, and representatives from the IT function. And then these committees should have regular meetings and report to senior management. But if you notice, this type of control, kaning category rather, it more on the IT department, diba? So this only applies to huge organizations because if you have a small organization lang, small business, of course you are not expected to hire IT personnel. Entire department, you may want to hire only one personnel IT, but you can afford to hire an entire IT department. So we could say that this part is only applicable to huge organizations or huge businesses. The IT function should be positioned within the organization so as to ensure its authority as well as its independence from user departments. Again, IT department should be separate from user departments. So kung kinsa ang mogamit sa softwares, dapat lahi ang ato ang IT department. The IT department should be independent from them. Of course, to avoid collusion. So if you've seen movies, like in my case, I've seen Suits. So na-adjust separate na separate floor for the IT department, and these IT people should not communicate with the other employees on a day-to-day basis. They will only come in if there is a need for them to perform IT-related tasks. But if wala, dapat dili sila makikchika dito sa mga persons from the user departments. Okay, staffing requirements should be evaluated whenever necessary to make sure that the IT function has sufficient competent staff. Okay. If you notice, again here, diba? This is the first category, and then we have administrative controls and then computer operation controls. So administrative controls, again, this particularly refers to segregation of duties. And what are the duties that we should separate? So these are the general guidelines for segregation of duties in information systems. So separate information systems from other departments. As I have mentioned a while ago, ang atong IT department should be kept separate from our user departments. So the information systems department or IT department personnel should be separate from the departments and personnel that they support. So the persons that they support are called users, such that these users belong to user departments. So example, users initiate and authorize all system changes, and a formal written authorization is required before our IT department could implement or could draft and implement these changes. Asset custody remains with the user department. So katong mga computers nga kung asa na-install ang mga softwares will remain within the user departments. Kay di man na sila gamiton sa ato ang IT department. An error log is maintained and referred to the user for correction. The data control group follows up on errors. Another segregation of duties is we should separate responsibilities within the IT department itself. Diba? The IT department should be separate from the user departments. And then, i-zoom in mo ang IT department, diba? Daghan man mga persons din ha. So, responsibilities also should be separate within the IT department itself. Okay. So, why is that? Because if a specific individual has unlimited access, this should give that individual an opportunity to perpetrate fraud. And we want to avoid that. So therefore, effective segregation of duties should be instituted by separating the authority for and the responsibility for the function. So segregation of duties within the IT department should be maintained between and among the following functions. So dapat lain-lain ni nga mga persons ang mubuhat ani nga mga functions. Okay, you can see here the duties of these various positions. So what should they do and what they shouldn't do, okay? So we have here systems analysts, we have the programmers, we have the computer operators and the data control group, data conversion operators, the librarians. Okay, another part of administrative controls is the supervision of control procedures. Diba? I've mentioned a while ago that we should implement segregation of duties. Again, when we say segregation of duties, kaning mga incompatible duties should be designated to different individuals. And plus, we should also have a supervisor. So we should have a supervisor to perform supervision of control procedures. So adequate supervision of personnel involved in the system's control procedures is necessary. Why? Because supervisors can spot weaknesses, correct errors, and identify deviations from standard procedures. So the supervisor is there to make sure nga whatever ato ang giingon nga plano, no nga, oy, Mr. A ang mubuhat ani, si Mr. B ang mubuhat ani. The supervisor will make sure that this plan is being followed. Because without adequate supervision, controls may be neglected or deliberately bypassed. So even though naatay gibuhat nga control in place, pwede man siya dili i-follow, no? So at least natay supervisor in place to make sure that whatever plans we have with respect to these type of controls are strictly followed. The second category of general controls is our general operating procedures. So here, let's review here. Okay, so this is the second category. So this second category refers to the manuals, diba? Mga manuals, written policies, and procedures. So the procedures should be documented and kept up to date for all IT operations. So these documentations, kaning mga written procedures, manuals, should include the following: the startup process, job scheduling, setup of processing jobs, instructions for running jobs, processing continuity during operator shift changes, operations logs, backup and recovery procedures, procedures that ensure connection and disconnection of links to remote operations. And then we should also make use of a turnaround document. What is a turnaround document? A turnaround document is a document created by a computer, and then some additional information is added to it, and it is returned to become an input document to the computer. So the documents are printed with optical character recognition or OCR fonts so that they can be read by the computer when they are scanned, and thus only the added information needs to be keyed in. The third category is your software, hardware, and access controls. I have mentioned this also a while ago. You have software controls. Here, we have to monitor the use of the software and prevent unauthorized access to it. Hardware controls, this refers to the actual hardware. It's kanang something that is tangible, that you can see, that you can touch. No, ang software magod is actually intangible. You cannot see it, but it is installed in the computer. But the hardware is there. It is tangible. It is physical. So we also have to implement hardware controls. So for example, computer equipment in the computer center should be kept in a locked room. Computer equipment should be protected from extremes of temperature and humidity. So for example, we might want to install a cooling system, cooling device. The location of the computer center should be in a place where it is protected from fire and other natural disasters as much as possible, because if the computer system will be destroyed, it will be hard for us to recover. The computer center should be equipped with smoke and water detectors, fire suppression devices, burglar alarms, and surveillance cameras monitored by the security personnel. And we should have a defined backup procedure. So we will discuss business continuity planning and disaster recovery in the next recorded discussion. Then another is your access control. Access controls include logical security and physical security. So logical security first. Logical security consists of access and ability to use the equipment to protect it from damage or theft, and data security controls to ensure that data files are not subject to unauthorized access. So we have here, for example, labeling of the contents of disks. So unsa may sulod ani niya. Yes, so disks, DVDs, and external hard drives. Tapes, flash drives. I'm not sure if anyone is still using flash drives. Because flash drives only have limited memory. Most of them are actually using katong very huge external hard drives. And then read-only file designation to prevent users from altering or writing over data. So for example, you are the treasurer and you want to verify the total amount of payroll for this particular payroll period. So you should only access the payroll file, but only read-only na access. Dili ka overwrite. So dili ka change anything. You can only view, but you cannot change. That is also an example of illogical security. DBMS used lockout procedures to prevent two applications from updating the same record or data item at the same time. So para dili mag-conflict ang mga updates. Logical security also includes internet security, such as firewalls and virus protection procedures. We will dwell or discuss internet security in particular in the next video as well. And then we have physical security. Very understandable, Raman said me, physical security. So computer processing center should be in a locked area. You can read this on your own because this is very much understandable. Some means of accomplishing access restrictions are, for example, have company personnel wear color-coded ID badges with photos to make sure that this particular employee is authorized to enter this area, or makibawta kung unsa ra kutob ang iyahang authority. An IT member should escort visitors when they enter the computer facilities, and a visitor's log should be kept and reviewed regularly. Para if na mga problems, we can always pinpoint kung kinsa ang mga persons nga responsible for these problems. We can also use magnetic ID cards, biometrics, physical locks, and a person can only enter if buzz. Kanang kita mo nang sa kung ano i-buzz in siya before siya makasulod. And then the use of keys as well. This time for application controls, again, when we speak of application controls, we focus on the input, process, and output stages. Input, processing, and output. So the application controls focus on the following objectives: input completeness and updating completeness, input accuracy and updating accuracy, validity, timeliness, accuracy, completeness. Output as well is accurate and complete, and that the records are available that track the progress of data from input to storage to output. So below are some things that can go wrong and that adequate controls can prevent, detect, and correct. So if we do not have these application controls, or if we do, but very weak, not effective, so these are the things that could go wrong. Input loss can occur when transaction information is transmitted from one location to another. So for example, if you are using computer number 1 and then transmit data to computer number 2, there might be a risk na some of the information that you have input here in computer 1 is lost when it was transmitted to computer number 2. There's also a risk of input duplication, inaccurate input because of typographical errors, missing information. Unrecorded transactions can occur as accidental failures. Okay, and then we have improper transactions, allowing improper transactions. Automated transactions may set up for regular orders or payments to suppliers. This actually happens, no, in one of my clients. They have set up a recurring invoice. Nya, pag na-stop na ang contract ato, nagsige lang gihapon og generate og invoice. So this will actually have an effect of overstating their income every month because of the recurring invoice. So that's actually one of the risks. Output can be sent to the wrong people or maybe sent too late to be used. Programming errors or clerical errors, delay in processing, and then lost files, poor documentation. So let's look at each classifications one by one. So again, we have input controls, processing controls, and output controls. So very much understandable, no, input controls. They provide reasonable assurance that input entered into the system has proper authorization, has been converted to machine-sensible form, and has been entered accurately. So these are the examples of input controls. We have data observation and recording. Under this, we have feedback mechanisms. So for example, a salesperson might ask a customer to confirm an order with a signature. So for example, ma'am, I can see here that you have ordered this much of this particular inventory. Can you confirm if this is correct? If may siya, yes. So that is an example of input control, feedback mechanism. Dual observation. Have more than one employee look at the input documents. So, di ba, usahay kabantay mo nga, if ikaw ang magbuhat, dili ka kabantay sa imong sayop, so you will have to ask somebody else to review it for you. So we call it dual observation. Point of sale services such as barcodes that are scanned can increase input errors. So kabantay mo sa mga department stores, supermarkets, they are now using barcodes because barcodes nig-scan na automatic nga mo input na sa system ang correct inventory data, correct price, and all other information related to the inventory nga gibaligya. Unlike kung i-manually type mo siya, there is a risk na masayop. So POS devices are very much useful kanang barcode scanner. Pre-printed forms. that ensure that all data required for processing have been captured. So, kanang naana siya form daan nga fill upan na lang nimo to make sure nga wala kay makalimtan nga information. Naa dito tanan. Batch control totals should be used in the input phase for transactions grouped in batches to track input as it travels from one place before it reaches the computer to make sure no input is lost. So for example, in my case, if I process batch payments for my clients, so na I batch na total. So if the batch total is comprised of all the invoices or bills that I have to pay, so in the process ana dito, I can verify if naabay nakalimutan nga bill or wala. And then we have tagging. We also have transaction logs to provide a source of control totals. And then another category under our input controls is your data transcription. So we can see here a pre-formatted input screen. So for example, a date field to be filled in would be presented on screen as this. So we have month, day, year. So it will make the input of data easy. Format checks also are there under data transcription. Format checks are used to verify that each item of data is entered in the proper mode. So for example, let's say mobile number. Kung mobile number ang ipangita, dili pwede maka-input pera o alphabets, no? So that is an example of a format check. Kung amount ang ipangita, dili pwede ka maka-input pera og mga special characters such as hyphen, dot, or hyphen, colon, apostrophe, no? So these are examples of format checks. Then edit checks, still under input controls hazard. Edit programs or input validation routines are programs that check the validity and accuracy of input data. So examples of edit tests, we have completeness or field checks. So kabantay mo na if mag-fill up mo Google form na ay marag asterisk, no? So if mo press mo continue without filling in the asterisk nga details, it will show us an error. So it will actually help us make sure that the data are complete. Limit checks. So this ensures that only data within predefined limits will be accepted by the system. So for example, an employee is tasked to work only for a maximum of 40 hours per week. So dili pwede maka-input og 50 hours kay ang limit niya is only 40. So that is an example of limit check. So the system, if mo input siya 50 hours, the system will reject the input. Validity checks, which match the input data to an acceptable set of values or match the characteristics of input data to an acceptable set of characteristics. This is somehow the same with your format checks. Overflow checks, which make sure that the number of digits entered in a field is not greater than the capacity of the field. So for example, the field only allows you to input 4 decimal places. So dili na ka pwede maka-input og 5th and more decimal places. Check digits, which determine whether a number has been transcribed properly. A check digit is a number that is a part of an account or other type of number. So for example, kabantay mo if, let's say, kung account number na siya, so naa siya particular nga numeric or alphanumeric ng mga characters nga naka-input dira. So for example, each account number should have a starting of the initials of the customer. So for example, in my case, MAJ. So MAJ 001. So dapat na MAJ. That is an example of a check digit. Key verification or keystroke verification is the process of inputting the information twice and comparing the two results. Kabantay mo anang if ever mag-change mo password. So, di ba, mag-input mo og new password and then dito confirm pa dyan. So you have to input it again to make sure that it is correct. hash totals. Hash totals are another type of control total. Hash totals are totals of non-monetary information. So, ang dili i-add. So, for example, di ba, if we have invoice numbers, so let's say, tulo ka book invoices ang gibayaran. So, we can add the invoice numbers, but in truth, no, these totals do not make sense, di ba? Kung i-add mo ang invoice numbers, non-monetary man na sila. So, if mo silang i-add, it will not make sense, mathematically speaking. But it could serve as a control because if na ay, for example, sa tulo ka invoice na ay replacean nga isa ka invoice, so inig-add mo na balik sa ilang invoice numbers, dili na siya mo match sa atong original nga hash total. So we could be informed nga there is something wrong na with the batch. Format checks, we all know what this is. Reasonableness checks, compare input with other information in existing records, and historical information to detect items of data that are not reasonable. So for example, we are to process an installment, nagbayad tag installment every month, let's say of 10,000. And then all of a sudden, nag-input of 30,000 nga installment. So that would appear as a red flag because it's not reasonable anymore because based on the prior months, we just paid 10,000 na installment. Numerical checks assure that numeric fields are used only for numeric data. So for example, if it is a name, it should not be inputted in the numeric fields. And then we can do reconciliations as well. So for reconciliations, we can compare two different documents and then match them. So for example, we can match the purchase order with the receiving report. Okay. So kung pilang i-order dapat mao ang na-receive, so we can match the purchase order with the receiving report. Okay, processing controls this time. Processing controls are controls designed to provide reasonable assurance that processing has occurred properly and that no transactions have been lost or incorrectly added. So processing controls fall into two classifications. First, data access controls, and then data manipulation controls. Data access controls, these are there to make sure that there are controls at the time of data access. Pag-view nimo sa data. Okay. We have examples, transmittal documents, such as batch control tickets, batch sequence numbers, batch control totals, hash total again. So if you notice, we can use hash total as an input control and at the same time as part of the processing controls. Then we have record count. So for example, ang gi-input dito nga gibayaran nga bills kay 10 kabuok. So the record count is 10. And then pag-process dapat 10 lang gihapon na sila. Data manipulation controls. These are controls involving data manipulation later in the processing. So for example, we have test data. Test data actually is you will have a simulated data used to test a computer program. So for example, na kay more hypothetical mga data and then you will input it into the system and then diba sa imong hypothetical data naanap kay hypothetical output in expected a hypothetical output. So imo ni siyang isud ang data sa computer program and then imong i-compare ang actual output niya sa computer program dito sa imong expected nga output. So if nagmatch ang output there is a computer program versus your expected output, then we could say that the computer program is functioning properly. The processing is correct. We can also do system testing. Other tests of processing include the following: batch balancing, cross-footing, zero balance check, run-to-run totals, and default option. Last category under application controls is your output controls. So again, output controls are there to provide reasonable assurance that input and processing have resulted in a valid output. So dapat sakto ang iyang output. So the output of the system is supervised by the data control group. Output controls are the following. Validating processing results. Activity or proof listings that document processing activity, provide detailed information about all changes to master files, and create an audit trail. We have transaction trails. Output totals should be reconciled with input and processing totals. Kung pila ang gibutang dito nga input, nga total, dapat after na siya pag-process and then human na siya ang iyang processing, the same lang gihapon ang totals para makaingon ta nga wala dyan na change while it was processed. A suspense account is used as a control total for items awaiting further processing. So in your actual practice, you can see an account, diba, sa inyong trial balance, makita mo dira og suspense nga account. Ang suspense nga account, sudlanan na siya sa mga transactions nga dili pa ta sure, nga kailangan pa siya i-review. Upstream resubmission is the resubmission of corrected error transactions as if they were new transactions, so that they pass through all the same detective controls as the original transactions. Then, so those are validating processing results, and then controls over printed output. So we can do forms control such as physical control over company blank checks. So normally ang mahitabuan na ang kaning mga check sa kabisi pa sa signatories, permahan na siya daan. Permahan na daan pero blanco pa ang amount and blanco pa ang payee. So the physical control over these blank checks is an example of a printed output control. So kani siya nga mga checks should be kept under lock and key. Kay since na naman siya permadaan, if na ay makakuhaan ng unauthorized person, they can just write their name as the payee and then they can put the amount and then encash it. So we should make sure that the blank checks are secured. Any form should be pre-numbered. So for example, kaning mga purchase orders nato, dapat naa na siya pre-numbered daan niya. Sunod-sunod na siya nga number. So 001, 002, 003, such that if na ay missing, makakita ta dayon, uy, na ay nakakuha diri og isa ka form nga unauthorized na unta. Output control also concerns report distribution. So, for example, if we have reports, kinsa man ang entitled to receive such type of reports. So, we should make sure that only those persons nga entitled to receive these reports are the ones receiving it. So, for example, ang janitor, no, ang janitor na to, dili siya dapat matagaan ng sales report. So, we should only distribute our reports to those persons entitled to them. And then confidential reports should be shredded when they are no longer needed para makasure ta nga ang confidential information will not be accessed by anyone. Okay? So again, just remember the very most important aspects of application controls, and these are your input, process, and output application controls. And then for general controls, ang pinaka-importante ani is segregation of duties and access controls. Okay, so again, this is the second to the last topic of our part 1 section 3. The next discussion, which will be the last discussion, will involve the discussion, will revolve around the discussion on internet security and business continuity planning. Thank you.